Hello and welcome to my video. This time we're looking at knowledge from perception. For those of you who've seen my videos before, you'll know that this is for AQA Philosophy 7171 and 7172, and as I'm always keen to point out, they are revision videos, nothing more than that. They're not a comprehensive overview of the topic, and you should refer to your notes, which I'm sure you'll have in abundance and which I'm sure you'll have gone over prior to watching this. Okay, so in philosophy, one of the areas that we're focusing on is whether the external world exists or not, a position that we might describe as realism or anti-realism, and also the way that we perceive this external world, whether we perceive it directly or indirectly. We're just going to go over a few of those theories within this particular video. Okay, so here is an overview of the content. Now you'll see the columns on the left: external world, perception method, philosophers, I can't say it, and problems, and then the various positions or the various theories: direct realism, indirect realism, and idealism. Now we're going to go through that today, but you can see that there are different positions that are being held. For example, two of those positions are that the external world is mind independent. One position is that the world is mind dependent. Some believe that you perceive the world directly, and some perceive that you perceive the world indirectly. So we'll have a look at those throughout this video. So the first theory that we're going to look at, and probably the easiest to understand, is direct realism. So in the case of direct realism, the theory is fairly straightforward. It basically says that the world as it appears to you is exactly as you see it. Objects are mind independent and exist in their own right. It's often described as naive or common sense realism. So, for example, as I'm sitting here, I can see a coffee table in front of me and a cup of coffee. And according to this theory, that cup of coffee exists independently of me, and it is just as it appears to be. So there are various problems that come up when it relates to this particular theory. Problem number one, and you obviously need to be aware of these, is the argument from illusion. Basically, that states that if it's true that we see the world as it is, then there is this argument from illusion. Basically, if you put a pencil, as you'll know, in a container with water in it, the pencil appears to be bent. Now, if that's actually the case in the real world, the pencil shouldn't appear to us to be crooked. It should appear to be straight, because that's how it is in the real world. So direct realists have to counter that argument. They do so by saying basically the pencil is not crooked, just that it has the property of looking crooked when placed in water. The second argument is the argument from hallucination, and this argument basically says that we see things which appear to be real, basically hallucinations, and they appear to exist in the external world, and yet are products of our minds. The third argument is the argument from perceptual variation, and this is associated with the philosopher Bertrand Russell. It basically says, well, when we look at a tabletop, as I'm doing at this moment in time, it looks very different from different positions. We might see it having different shades of colour or different size, etc. And I guess you're familiar with that kind of concept, or this argument from perceptual variation, through optical illusion. So the next slide just is an illustration of that. So you're all familiar with optical illusions, which basically sort of say, well, look at these two tables. One's long and thin, one's more square, but actually they have the same dimensions. And when you take a ruler to them, as you can be my guest, they do have the same dimensions. So the argument from perceptual variation is, how are we seeing that item in the external world as it is, if from different points of view it looks very different? Okay, the fourth problem is the time lag argument. And the time lag argument basically says that when you look at the sun, it takes 8 minutes for the sun's light to reach us. Therefore, we see the sun indirectly. We don't actually see the sun as it is at this moment in time, because the light from the sun has taken 8 minutes to get here. One of the questions you might want to think about is, how would direct realists respond to not only this argument, but the other arguments that I presented? Right, so the next theory is indirect realism. So unlike direct realism, indirect realism basically argues that you experience the world indirectly through sense data. And the advantage of this argument is that it avoids some of the problems that we experience with direct realism. One of the things that we note here is that our sense data is private to us, and as such, each person can perceive the world differently. One of the philosophers that's associated with this type of argument is the empiricist John Locke. And John Locke describes the world as being mediated through primary and secondary qualities. Now, how he does this is he basically says that an object, or any object, I'm going to use an example of a sofa here, has some primary qualities. Basically, its size, shape, and number. I've got one sofa that I'm looking at. It is a particular shape and it's a particular size, and these are objective qualities. We can measure them. We can count the number of sofas. We can see how many centimeters wide the sofa is, etc. But it also has secondary subjective qualities, things like color and feel. So whilst the sofa to me looks as if it's sort of light grey, someone else may disagree and say, no, it's a dark grey sofa. So that it has, as I say, some subjective qualities such as colour and feel. So some of the problems associated with indirect realism, the first one, and perhaps the most difficult to overcome, is our experience of the world through sense data. And the difficulty with that is that if we're experiencing it through sense data, we can't experience it directly, and we can't experience the world as it is. In turn, this leads to skepticism about the external world. It's described as looking at the world through the veil of perception. One of the questions that must arise from this is, if we're looking at the external world through sense data, and everything is experienced through sense data, how do we know it actually exists as it is, or even exists at all? Again, Bertrand Russell is the philosopher who's associated with this argument, and he basically states there's no way to get beyond the veil of perception, but from his perspective, an external world is the best explanation for why we have sense data in the first place. Okay, Locke's response is basically to these kind of arguments is that when confronted by an object, it's not possible to avoid the sense data that it produces. So if you look at anything, I don't know, in the room around you, you cannot possibly deny the sense data that you're receiving from those objects. So if you're looking at a cup, you can't deny that the cup is there. In contrast, you can choose what you imagine. So if you want to close your eyes and imagine that, I don't know, you're in Disneyland, you can do so. The second response is that our senses can confirm different sense data. So earlier on, I wrote down the information that appears in this presentation, and later on, once I've recorded the video, I can hear that information being read back to me. So different sense data seems to confirm other sense data. Right, the last theory we're going to look at is idealism. And in the case of idealism, the view is that there is no external world, and as such, it's an anti-realist theory. Now, whenever we come across these things like realist, anti-realist, etc., you're going to have to watch these several times or familiarise yourself with the term several times. But basically, Berkeley says that objects of perception are mind dependent. In other words, all that exists are basically ideas. Now, the person who's associated with this, as I've mentioned before, is Bishop Berkeley, and he was responding directly to John Locke's empiricism and what he perceived as secularism. Obviously, Bishop Berkeley believed in God, and he wanted God to be in the equation somewhere. So Berkeley believes that what we perceive are qualities. Now, that sounds very much like Locke. However, unlike Locke, Berkeley basically states that these are all secondary qualities. So, for example, an elephant is large or small depending on how you perceive it. If you're standing right next to the elephant, it will seem very large. If you put the elephant next to a blue whale, maybe less so. Or if you're looking at it from, quite a distance away, it seems to be quite a small animal. So primary qualities, according to Berkeley, are mind dependent. The next thing that Berkeley does is construct this thing called the master argument. Now, it's well worth going over that and the dialogue relating to this. But basically, Berkeley asks us to imagine a tree not perceived by anyone. According to Berkeley, as soon as we think of a mind-independent object, it becomes mind-dependent. So the next question would be, well, what causes these ideas? Berkeley basically says, well, these ideas are not caused by ideas themselves because ideas don't alone cause anything. Slightly confusing, so you probably be best to go through your notes and look at that again. The second thing, it's not my own mind, as I could control what I perceive. So, I don't have any control over the things that are presented in front of me. Therefore, it must be another mind, and as a bishop, guess whose mind it's going to be? Of course, it's going to be God's. And Berkeley basically says, well, not only does God have these objects which he's created in our mind, but basically they are there constantly in the mind of God and as such permanently accessible. How can I explain that? I guess it's a bit like God holding the master photocopy and we've got, the photocopy of that. That's why objects don't sort of disappear when we leave the room, because they are permanently there. God is basically holding the sort of master of that particular item. Okay, there are problems associated with Berkeley's arguments, and one of the problems is that of solipsism. It's basically the belief that everything is mind dependent, and in that regard, only on one mind. So I'm only concerned with what's in my own mind, and therefore I don't really need to be concerned whether other minds exist at all. The second problem is there appears to be no distinction between perceptions such as hallucinations and reality. If, as Berkeley states, to be is to be perceived, a quote that you want to learn, then surely hallucinations have as much coherence as reality.